Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful panel, and I think we've spoken at length already about climate change and the fears ahead and the challenges that we're facing, which we're already facing. Climate change is not going to wait for anyone. I'm glad the US is back in the climate change negotiations, and I hope it remains so next year as well. And you know, for India especially, climate change brings a lot of challenges given that we have such a huge population that lives in poverty, and the extreme, you know, weather that we're seeing, the storms, the flooding, the heat, etc. It's a huge challenge for us, especially as we're still a developing nation. And that is something that, you know, going forward has been, you know, an issue when you negotiate, and all these climate change negotiations take place year after year, and one wonders that, you know, we're in the midst of it, and still these negotiations get stuck in various points. And of course, the developed world, developing world, there are all those challenges. But first and foremost, Peter, about your book, I mean, it's a massive book. It makes you feel this small in terms of where we are. And if you look at the history of the planet and all the ups and downs and transformations the Earth has already seen. So what do you feel are the lessons from the past when we're looking at the challenges of today?
Thank you, Gargi. Thank you for including me on this wonderful panel. Well, we're all, I mean, the first line of my book says we as human beings should be very grateful for climate change. It's always good to have a good opening line of a book, particularly if it's a long one. But for 99.99999% of our Earth's existence, our life form wouldn't have been supported by the climatic envelope that the world lives in, either because of too little oxygen, too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, excessive heat, or excessive cold temperatures. So if you believe in the theory of evolution, which I think most people tend to do, then you learn that animals have to adapt to their environments, and if they don't, they make films like Jurassic Park about dinosaurs, about animals that are extinct, and that will probably happen to us. I mean, to every animal, if you exceed your capabilities, then you don't survive. So the question will be, what does that look like? How does that happen? And can we actually control the environmental changes that we're part of? And I think we won't have a chance in the next 36 minutes to discuss, let alone agree, exactly the role of anthropogenic climate change relative to the very complex global climate systems, the ways in which the planet moves, the El Niño, La Niña signature, behavior of the sun, and so on. But it's very unusual for animals to destroy their own habitats, which is what we do. You know, we're the only species that eats too much and then goes to the gym. You know, we're the only creature that can see what it is, the damage of the choices that we make, throwing rubbish out of the car in Jaipur on the side of the road, or which I don't do, by the way, of course, but you know, just it seems that a few other people might do. But I think that the bottom line is that we've been through 5 mass extinctions, and we and every other animal and plant pathogen on this earth today alive with us are beneficiaries of those terrible cataclysms. And if you are one of the 96 or 97% of animal species that were destroyed by previous catastrophes, then you should probably learn from that. Just as a quick final footnote, if you don't believe in the theory of evolution, and whether it's you're from the Hindu tradition or Christian or Islamic, whatever it is, pretty much every single global religion has as part of its foundational texts the importance of respect for nature and of the worries of what happens if the floods don't come or the rains don't come or there's too much drought. We find that in the Rig Veda, we find that through the Bible, Book of Genesis, the Quran, you name it. And so all of our common ancestors have been deeply, deeply concerned about what happens if those environmental casino bet goes the wrong way. Those accelerations, as Jeff has written about, well, I was going to say beautifully, but probably that's the wrong word. So clearly, is that you know, you don't get a second chance. That's what history teaches you.
Well, your book also spoke about how this is inevitable, and the Earth, as you said, has been through so much already, and you know, this is just another sort of microcosm of what the Earth has already experienced, and it almost makes it feel like all our, you know, chest beating and franticness around climate change is useless because it's something the Earth is going to experience. I want to come back to that, but Jeff, I want to talk to you about you know, your book about the heat, and I was just discussing with him, there's this chapter in his book in which this family goes for a trek, for a hike, and then they're found dead and they died because of heat exposure. And in India, we have a huge respect for heat. As we all know, we have the Loo, which is this hot wind that blows during the summer, and we're always told, children are told to cover their heads. We eat more onions. It's supposed to help you, deal with the heat. But this clearly is a challenge going forward in countries that have not experienced heat and are now going to be experiencing it. I think in 2022 and the year before that, we saw in Europe as well, many elderly passed away because they just could not deal with the heat, and they weren't equipped to do that. So about that, if you could talk a bit.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I think the best way for me to talk about that is just to talk about how I started this book and why I wrote this book. I've been writing about climate change in various forms for 25 years. And yet, the idea of, I never really thought a lot about heat, even though it's not like exactly a secret. Global warming kind of gives the idea away a little bit. And I happened to be in Phoenix after my previous book, which was about sea level rise. And I had a meeting on downtown on a very hot day, and it was about 42 C or something that day. And I missed my Uber, and I had to run to the meeting to get there. And by the time I went the 20 blocks downtown, I was dizzy. I thought I was going to faint. My heart was pounding. And I realized if I had to go another 20 blocks, I would be in big trouble. And despite the fact that I had been writing about climate change for so long, it didn't occur to me that heat can kill you and kill you quickly. And that was a revelation to me, despite the fact that, as I said, I've been writing about climate change for a long time. And I was talking to a friend that night, and I realized also that I didn't know what heat was. If you asked me that day to explain what is heat, I would have talked about temperature and measurements, but if you asked me, I could not have explained what it was. And that's where the idea for the book was born, that heat is unlike, say, sea level rise. No one is going to sit on the beach and drown in real time because a glacier is collapsed in Antarctica. Whereas if you get an extreme heat wave, as you do here, as we do, I live in Texas, we had a brutal heat this summer, you can die in a matter of hours. And that was the sort of focusing idea for my book. And I wanted to talk about how climate change is so often talked about as something that's happening in the future to future generations, to people other than ourselves, maybe with different color skins in faraway places. I really wanted to talk about it in an intimate way, in the way it can kill you if you're out and taking a walk on the wrong day and you don't know what to do. And I will add that, as you pointed out, people in India are very experienced with heat.
Yeah, we have a lot of respect for heat, and we would never be running in the heat, we would never jog in the heat, we'd be very, very careful, but yes. Oh.
Closer?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's true. I mean, I know that's true, but it's also true that it won't necessarily save you, right? I mean, our bodies are, as Peter talked about, we've evolved over time in a very sort of steady niche of temperatures. And our bodies are very good at dealing with temperature as long as they're within a certain range. We have one mechanism for dealing with heat, which is sweat, which is why drinking water is so important. But once that temperature range gets beyond what our body can handle, you get in trouble really, really quickly. And in my book, I talk about this idea that, again, references what Peter was talking about. And the big picture is this idea of the Goldilocks zone, that we have evolved in this range of temperatures that's fairly narrow. And as the heat rises, last year was the hottest year in human history, we're moving out of that Goldilocks zone. And it's more and more difficult for our bodies and everything that we have built for our world to deal with these changes in temperature. And the consequences of this are immense in a personal way and in a sort of civilizational way, in how we build our buildings, how our power systems work, all kinds of ways.
No, absolutely. And in your book, you spoke about that couple in Chennai, and the wife works as a domestic help in several houses, but her husband is home. And when I say that we don't go out in the heat, but at home also it can kill you because it's just, the temperatures are just so high, and the wife feels guilty because she works in these homes that have air conditioning, but her husband has to stay at home in that heat, and she keeps worrying about him because he wasn't very well, or he had some health problems. So yes, of course, the heat challenge, especially in India with so many people in poverty, not having access to electricity or air conditioning and fans, that's a big worry. But Siddharth, your book, you talk about a lot of solutions, and I really enjoyed reading it for that purpose, because I think we need to communicate that better. It needn't all be so dire, and we need to talk more about solutions as well when you talk about regenerative farming or rewilding. So if you could talk a bit about that, about what you found during your journeys to various corners of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I focus on the solutions because I think we don't hear enough about them. But I also spoke about the solutions because I just found them as I traveled around the world. I mean, it wasn't like I was looking for an optimistic story. And to be fair, it's not that optimistic if you read the book. But I was really surprised by how much is happening, including communities you've never heard of. So I used to live in Palo Alto. There's lots of people think of when they say Silicon Valley. But there's innovations and technology that are just as amazing that are in Kenya and Fiji and India. So it was exciting to bring those stories to life as part of the book. But before I talk about solutions, I think it's worth framing the problem I was looking at, which is slightly different from what we've been discussing. So I think, Peter, you set it up pretty nicely. There's been huge transformations in the Earth's climate multiple times over the last 6 billion years. Every single one of those cascades, to my knowledge, has been external as a shock. And you're totally right that what we're doing right now is in some ways unprecedented, where we are dramatically modifying our environment. We know we're doing it, and we still do it. But the other way in which it's really important is, I think that humans are doing stuff that has an impact on climate, is already having an impact on climate, and is going to be increasingly bad, as Jeff points out. But the main mechanism for species loss, biodiversity loss, nature loss has not been climate up to this point in human history. It's actually been habitat loss, overexploitation, and the species that we have spread around the world that have caused extinctions. So if you think about what's come, it's actually not so much about climate, and it's more about the fact that we are incredibly good at destroying other species, their habitats, and so on. So, in some ways, these are two linked problems, the nature and biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. They're incredibly urgent, but part of my pitch was to say, we've done a decent job, and people like Jeff and Peter have done a really good job of communicating the urgency of the climate crisis. With the nature crisis, I think there's still quite a lot of nature denialism that goes on, where you look at images of, and I mean, I grew up on these, right? Beautiful savannas full of animals, romping through these. And you think, wow, nature is amazing, which is an important starting point. But then what you don't get is the second layer of what's the true state of nature right now. And by and large, we manage this entire planet. There are very few places that are not entirely human dominated, even ones we think of as wild. And so that's the problem I was trying to frame. It wasn't so much how do we solve the climate crisis. There's a big chunk of it, which is how can nature help us solve the climate crisis. But it's actually much broader about our relationship to the living world, and so on. So in terms of solutions, I'll be really quick. The way we grow food is incredibly important. I mean, it's an amazing achievement that we can feed this many billions of people safely, and we produce more calories than we need. So many more calories than we need that we can actually feed these calories to other animals and then eat them, and we still have enough calories. So it's amazing, the system we have. But there are ways now of doing the same kind of farming to get much better output with much better outcomes for soil, for nature, and for people. So that was a really important part of it, the food system. The other thing I want to highlight is, there are communities across the world where they live in incredible natural habitats, but they're not necessarily able to access traditional markets or government support. And so I looked at other ways you could financial innovations, market innovations, even things that are old ideas but could be applied in better ways, like ecotourism, to help create sustainable local economies for nature protection and restoration. So it took me to India, Fiji, Palau, all over the US, all over Europe, Brazil, Kenya, And every single one of those places had amazing innovations and people who were doing it from the ground up. So
that's something we need to encourage, more, ground up solutions and listening to the people who you actually live there. But Peter, if we're talking solutions, I know there's so much climate anxiety these days, especially for the younger generation. I feel bad. I mean, when I was growing up, I was looking forward to, flying hoverboards like Marty McFly and Back to the Future. But this generation, the young people, it's just so dire. So what would you say? What are the lessons from nature?
Well, I grew up in a world where I didn't think about flying on hoverboards. I was expecting nuclear holocaust in my lifetime.
Okay,
I'm a child of the Cold War.
There was also the ozone layer,
it might be we come back
about.
there, but it's a hard toss-up. Was the world scarier in the 1980s than it is today? And we can talk about climate and the things that are coming towards us, but it takes one person's decision in any number of global capitals to bring the whole
and it does
whole game
confound
to
me that we're experiencing
conclusion.
2 wars right now,
Right.
even as we speak.
I mean, as far as solutions go, I'll give you a very simple one that doesn't cost anything. The single biggest driver of inequality is exam performance of young people, particularly in schools. And there's lots of work that's been done, particularly in the US, around schools that don't have air conditioning and performances of kids in low-income parts of New York City and New York State, and how they will underperform if the temperatures, particularly if it's above 30 degrees. For every half degree beyond, there's an incremental decrease in performance in a schoolroom where it's hot. That's pretty obvious, right? So why test kids in June, July here in India, right? If you want kids to perform well, install air conditioning in low-income schools. Make sure that you try and give equalities to kids that's cheap, right? Simple to do, rethinking how we do basic stuff. It doesn't all have to be battery generation, trillions of dollars that goes into infrastructure. The amazing panel yesterday with Malcolm Turnbull and the kinds of things that are being done. Siddi's exactly right. There's incredible innovation. There's lots of money. People do understand what the problem is, but there's some really low-hanging, pretty basic fruit. All of us here at JLF know about food inequality and poverty and so on. Globally, we grow about 930 million tons of food a year that's discarded.
And we waste, yes.
That fills 23 million 40-ton trucks, which if you stretch them around the circumference of the Earth would go around 7 times, right? I live in a city, Oxford, which is notionally pretty wealthy, but we have some of the highest levels of poverty in the United Kingdom, some of the highest literacy problems, all the kind of things that cascade. So, if you want to have an equalized society, how do you, like Sid said, how do you use what you've already got more efficiently? And what's staggering is that every single person in this room, if we average it out, we all throw away about 30% of the food that comes into our house. Doesn't matter whether you're high income, low income, median income, we all perform the same. Restaurants do quite well, typically will throw away about 8% of their food. But food discard that's grown is responsible for about 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you tackle pretty obvious problems? How do you redistribute more equitably? You mentioned India's a developing nation. Per capita income here, $2,000, $2,500. There are lots of people who've come out of extreme poverty but are still food poor. So,
Yes.
I think having socially progressive policies that try to bring everybody along together are not that hard, but some of the wheels get stuck by political decision making and by the idea that the decisions need to be big, right? Just change the calendar year. Test kids in December rather than in June. So I'm doing some work with the cricket authorities in the UK. Cricket is one of my kind of hobbies, pastimes. But you say people don't run in 40-degree heat. We make international sports take place above 35 degrees a lot of the time, right? And it's not just stress to life because of breathing and the sweat doesn't work. Cognitive decision-making, organ damage, the kinds of ways in which your ability to react to things that are dangerous, like a cricket ball coming at you at 90 miles an hour, puts people at risk, and not everybody's a Virat and can handle that. So I think thinking about how then do we do the start of the day? What time should we start school? What should we do in the middle of the day? Just because our people did this for 200 years doesn't mean we should be stuck by those paradigms.
So start thinking about these simple solutions. Yeah. Jeff, about technology, do you think technology is something that can hold something in the future, some sort of solution? Because at the time of the Paris negotiations and when they spoke about reducing the carbon output, etc., since then, within a few years, renewables had advanced so much, wind and solar, and we'd made such huge advancements that those aims were within grasp. So going forward, do you feel that maybe in all of this, in terms of our energy needs, there'll be some big technological sort of breakthrough or solution?
I think that we've already seen that. I mean, the cost of renewable energy has dramatically dropped in the last decade. You know, it makes no sense to build fossil fuel power plants virtually anywhere in the world anymore. The economics are clearly on the side of change, and reducing emissions is the most important thing because it is the burning of fossil fuels that put CO2 in the atmosphere that is driving the warming. However, I wanted to make a couple of points about this. One is that economics are not enough, right? This is not just a level playing field where whoever has the cheapest power wins. The fossil fuel industry, both in the United States, in India, and virtually everywhere in the world, has tremendous political power. One example, at the Glasgow COP a couple of years ago, there was a passage of a resolution to cut fossil fuel subsidies globally. That was seen as a really important goal. At that time, fossil fuel global subsidies were $2 trillion. And the idea was, okay, we need to get rid of these because we need to level the playing field, right? What has happened? Glasgow was what, 3 years ago? The global fossil fuel subsidies have gone from 2 trillion to 7 trillion instead of going down. So as the end game for the fossil fuel industry comes into view, they are exerting more and more political power to keep it going, which is a big part of when we think about solutions. One other thing I want to say about solutions is that we're talking about the economics of clean power, which is really important. And it's relatively easy to funnel money into that. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I know about entrepreneurialism. I worked at Apple back in the days when Steve Jobs was running around barefoot quoting Bob Dylan lyrics. And so there's a lot of money flowing into clean energy because you can make a lot of money. The problem is on the whole other side of the conversation about how we're going to adapt to this hotter world and where the money flows come from on that side. There's the loss and damage fund that we see at the COP thing, which is endlessly complicated, trying to get the richer nations to help poorer nations adapt. But it's very hard to channel the sort of entrepreneurial energy that is driving the energy revolution into building better cities, into helping people in poverty adapt to rising sea levels or increased heat and all those kinds of things. So this solutions idea is at once incredibly hopeful, but also more complicated than it first looks.
Right, absolutely. And I can't believe how much depends going forward on how the US elections will go at the end of this year. But Siddharth, let's talk about India as well. In India, we have a wealth of forests and natural areas. And during the negotiations on climate change, yes, India, we champion the developing world and their rights to development, given that, historically it is the developed countries that are responsible for the situation we're in. But how can India negotiate better? How can we use our wealth of biodiversity and forests to, show what all we have, and we'll protect, hopefully. And because even in India, we have a lot of dangers in terms of mining and dams, etc., and destroying what we already have, this wealth of forests and biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I should say is India and China are maybe the two exceptions to the narrative that the developing world has largely not been responsible for the climate crisis. Virtually every other country, this is true. Almost nothing has been contributed by these countries. But India, I think, depending on how you calculate, is somewhere between 5th and 3rd in terms of historical emissions. So this is a major. We're now a major economy. We have over 1 billion people. We have a responsibility, right? I don't see this as let's pass the begging bowl around and wait for rich countries to give us enough money to do this. So what I was really surprised by when I was doing my research is there are solutions at every level that actually work, where the economic benefits are almost immediate. So you think about, back to the conversation we were just having, cities and bringing nature back, and creating urban green spaces has immediate benefits for people. And you're seeing, cities across India, they don't call it climate adaptation, right? They call it I don't know what they call it, but you're seeing demand from every level of society for cities that are more livable, that happen to be cities that are greener and more resilient to climate change. Right, at the international level, if you think about our national targets, India has about 27% forest cover. There's a conservation goal that the world has set to preserve and protect and restore about 30% of land and 30% of sea. The trouble is what we define as forests includes lots of plantations, and the kind of true native forests are really a threat. And so places like India have the trickiest trade-offs, right? Massive growing populations, but incredible biodiversity that has survived for hundreds of years of post-industrial development. You look at the UK and it's basically an ecological desert at this point. So it's much easier to look at the rolling hills and say it's so nice, but actually that has been deforested land that is now a sheep farm. So what I'd say with India is we have lots of potential to change the way things are done. I'm most encouraged by the fact that people at every level, particularly the ones who rely on nature for their living, so farmers and people who live on the land, they see the impacts of climate change. They see the impacts of soil microbiomes being destroyed. They see the impacts of biodiversity loss, and they're demanding change. And I think eventually, hopefully, that trickles up.
I think there needs to be help everywhere. I think farming is stressed right now. There's a lot of challenges over there. I'd like to open it up for any questions now. Yes, go ahead. Lady there.
Two questions. One, I would like you to comment on veganism. One is that, I, for example, might feel guilty about eating an animal, killing it. But then veganism as something that, somehow is going to save the climate. I would like you to comment on it. And second, in India, there's a lot of push on green energy. For example, the EVs. But we are not actually using solar energy for it. So it's the same energy, electricity from the coal power plants. Shouldn't we actually first focus on building, natural energy infrastructure for that?
Jeff, would you like to answer about veganism? I got asked this in yesterday's session as well. Somebody said eating less meat is better for the planet, but yes, go ahead.
Well, eating less meat, purely from a climate point of view, is hugely better. It's one of the major contributors to CO2 emissions, especially industrial meat production. I live in Texas, where, barbecue joints and eating meat is, you will get kicked out of the country if you out of the state if you admit that you're a vegan. I mean, they have like vegan patrols that go around the streets looking for you. They have some kind of detectors. You haven't eaten meat in a week. Get them out of here. It's a very in the meat we talked about a little bit about the political power of the fossil fuel industry. The political power of the sort of beef industry, certainly in the United States, is huge, and it's a huge cultural battle also. That is really important, and I think that, for a lot of reasons, that's going to change. There's a lot of innovation around how we think of meat, lab-grown meat, things like that I know sounds disgusting and weird, and eating crickets and all kinds of things like that. But I think there's an inevitability to that. But yes, that's a really important part of this battle that is not talked about enough. You want me to say anything about the second half, or show someone else?
If you keep going, Jeff. Go on.
About the shift to electric vehicles, or whether we should wait until we have more solar power and things. I don't think it's an either or. I think we need to move everything electric as quickly as possible. We're seeing that happening in the United States. President Biden has pushed really hard in the Inflation Reduction Act for subsidies and help to stimulate electric car production and charging. I think you have to do both simultaneously. And a lot of work has shown, even if you do have a coal-fired electric vehicle, if it's mostly from coal-fired power, it's still cleaner and better than a gas-fueled vehicle. So I think that this transformation is not going to happen neatly. It's going to happen both solar and electric vehicles.
But we need to do whatever we can and not wait for the other. Yes, that lady over there, the back in the red. The mic.
Hello everyone, I'm Nidhi. I work for International Solar Alliance, which works exclusively for the deployment of solar energy across the world. My question is, do you think carbon tax can be a game changer in the whole clean and just energy transition?
Okay, Siddharth.
Sure. So, Nidhi, I think the latest stat from the World Bank is something like 27% of global emissions are currently priced. So either carbon tax or a cap and trade system. The trouble is the average price of that is less than $10 a ton. So it doesn't create the incentive to drive down emissions, except in a few regions. So that, if you think about the European both the border adjustment taxes coming in, but also the emissions trading system, it's been incredibly effective at driving down emissions. It's just, you have to set the price high enough to drive change, and you have to acknowledge that there will always be some emissions that are too expensive to avoid or remove through industrial decarbonization, and so then we're going to have to find other solutions, whether it's nature or kind of carbon removal more generally. But I think the short answer is yes.
All right. All right, this gentleman here. Yeah. Can you get the mic? There.
Thank you. I was there at a session yesterday at which it was said that the most pivotal moment which is coming in the climate change fight is the US elections, wherein
I believe so.
wherein 1% of the world's population's actions are going to actually govern the fate of the world. What do you think can the rest of the world do to influence the US electorate in favor of climate action?
I don't think we want to influence elections. You know, I think Russia is doing enough of that probably as it is. But Peter, would you like to say something on this about, are we too US dependent when it comes to our climate fight? Or do we have no choice?
Look, you know, there's headline chasing that goes on with all of this. I mean, you know, I think that each country has its own democratic traditions in the West and here in India, and we also have to respect how, even if we don't agree ourselves with the way elections go, that there is the right to have a chance to vote. And a lot of the countries I work on, those chances are either non-existent or they are illusory. So I don't think there's any great deal of doubt who's going to win the elections in Russia this year. And good luck if you want to have a vote in China about its energy policies. So, you know, I think that the global commons is a real issue. For what it's worth, and it's a sort of slightly throwaway line and a little bit glib, the real question is, do democratic states currently perform better in their provision of investment into clean energies or not? In China right now, there's enough renewable energy to power every single residential unit in China, right? If you look at innovation, look at capital flows, look at R&D, look at people taking this seriously, there are all sorts of reasons why: supply chains, strategic interests, long-term problems, et cetera, you know. But I don't want to laugh at other people in the world for the decisions they make. I believe, as a Democrat, that you have to trust that institutions will lead to good outcomes. So there is a difference between the headlines of a single individual who never controls the system. You know, that might change if things do turn into autocracies, but that doesn't happen very often. And I'm not pessimistic enough to think that just because that's what, you know, makes people laugh. So I'm sanguine, but it's a real issue and a real problem. You know, as Sid said, you know, when you look at India, China, Gulf, Russia, Saudi Arabia, US, should these states be doing more? Show me one country that's doing enough, right? And then we can have a talk about how we should follow in those footsteps. But it looks to me that no one is going the right way. IRA has been important in the US, hugely, but it's 40 years too late. So when Gloria was talking in the introduction about what the US has done, in 1974, the CIA produced a really important, long, detailed report about the impacts of climate change.
Yes.
In 1989 and in 92, at the Earth Summit, George Bush Sr. said that if we didn't start to deal with climate change and with green policies, our children and grandchildren's generation wouldn't forgive us. And in fact, our energy consumptions, our consumptions of water, our waste of food, have gone up very, very dramatically since 1992. Partly because we've offset here and there are pockets of wins. But, you know, these have been long-term problems that we haven't adjusted to well enough. So I'd rather keep it to practical policies.
Jeff, anything you'd like to add to that? No, I think you said it well. Okay, all right. Yes, more questions. Yes, young man here. Yeah.
My question is to Siddharth. Siddharth, you spoke of solutions, and often it's said that say traditional farming methods or permaculture or organic farming is just not, the yield is not enough to feed a world of so many mouths. And hence monoculture or industrial farming is necessary. How, statistically speaking, how true or false that is, and is there any research around that?
It's a really good question. There's been lots of analyses done on this. I think you can configure the food system however you want, right? You can configure it to produce maximum calories, which is kind of what we do right now. But then we use those calories very inefficiently. We waste about a third. We feed a bunch to animals. And so what we get at the other end is barely enough for it to feed us, right? You could configure the same system differently. So you could start with a smaller number of calories, you know, that come directly to us and are not wasted. And you could actually use less land and farm, you know, organically. But the point isn't just everyone needs to go organic and stop using chemical fertilizers and pesticides. There are lots of steps in between that can help nature recover, that do actually shift the system from what it is right now. But I think for some people in some places, pure organic farming is going to be the right answer. There's other steps in between.
This is just a doubt that's haunting me for a long time. We discuss so much in terms of giving awareness to the common man about green earth and things like that. But isn't it the wars that contribute to a greater extent to the global warming? Just one war would contribute in greater percentage. Why are we not giving awareness on that? That emitters.
I did mention that it confounds me we're in the midst of two wars, but Jeff, would you like to take that?
Can you repeat the question for me or rephrase it?
She's just saying that when we worry about our own carbon emissions and flying here or driving there, but we have wars going on, and that contributes so much more to emissions and heat and.
Yeah, it does. I mean, keeping our military industrial complexes funded and building all of the machinery of war and fueling all the machinery of war is a big part of this story that does not get talked about nearly enough, for sure. But it's also really important in that it, as we see right now, it takes our attention. It's something we focus on right now, rightfully so. Like what's going on in the Middle East is a huge part of our daily attention diet right now. So we think about that. There's always the immediate crisis that is happening in our world that makes it very difficult to focus on these sort of longer term transitions and changes and challenges that we face. So I think it works two ways. One in the practical way of keeping the war machinery going, and then the other way of how we focus our attention. But I will say in my reporting, especially in my sea level rise book, I spent a lot of time with the US military, and they understand what's happening very well. And they understand how the shift in resources is changing the global geopolitics. They understand the limits of fossil fuels to fuel their war machinery, for better or for worse. They understand the necessity of moving naval bases around because of sea level rise. So just as climate change is going to transform every other aspect of our lives, it's also going to transform how we think about our military and war and conflict. And I won't even go into migration and the challenges of that.
All right. Yes. I mean, I think that's the best we can say right now in the midst of the wars, as we're using up our munitions and more are going to be produced. And it's crazy.
I'm sorry, but this subject is very dear to my heart. And I spend every day at least half an hour on the internet looking at climate change. Incidentally, Jeff, my brother's in Dallas. I speak to him every day. And this year has been one of the hottest in Dallas. I think much more than 40 degrees centigrade. And one of the things I notice is that, like here, you see all the seats are not occupied. There's a lot of less awareness about this issue. And one of the things, because of this, is that, should I ask you also, is that it's not in front of us. This problem is never in front of us. It's, you don't see it, you only know it. And if you can see the problem in front of you, then you become more aware. And I'm sure, I thought this audience would be overcrowded, but it is not.
Maybe it's the rain and early morning. But I understand, sir, what you're saying. You're absolutely right.
What I'm saying is that, you see, the other issues are permafrost, for instance. That is, again, not seen and not known. Besides water level rising and, this forestation and deforestation. And
all right.
we are trying to do a corrective. And the tribal way of life earlier, where they live in the jungles and they live with nature, that is what is we have to head for.
All right, well, we did talk about climate anxiety, sir, and it's very real. I think at NDTV, we've always tried to create awareness, and I think we are seeing it. We're seeing it in the flash floods, and we're seeing it in the, cyclones that are coming more often. But very quickly, Peter, if you could answer that.
Well, last year was the global average hottest year for 100,000 years. We have the highest concentrations of carbon dioxide potentially for 16 million years, depends on how you measure it and whether the latest readings done in December are right. So no human in any form of recorded history, human experience has lived in the conditions that we live today. And as Jeff has said and Sid has said, we're not all in this together. If you're in a tropical region, you've got a different set of problems and opportunities, more problems and opportunities than if you live in Northern Hemisphere countries where potentially there are benefits. In Russia, climate change is a very good thing. In fact, the second verse of the Russian national anthem talks about the days when the permafrost will melt and the Russian fields will expand and grow. So I think we're right to be worried, and we all lived through the pandemic. There are about 500 emerging infectious diseases. 3/4 of those are highly susceptible to shifts in climatic change. And so although a warming world is bad for us, it's great for other kind of organisms. And we don't want to go there again, but improving our healthcare systems, our ability to handle big data, to be able to identify problems quicker, solve them, etc., we probably should be on the front foot, to use a cricket term, rather than playing on the back foot against spin.
All right. Well, I'm so sorry. We'll have to end it there. You heard the buzzer go off. But all the authors are going to be at the author sign. You can get their books and get them to sign them, and you can ask more questions.